Good evening and welcome everyone to this webinar organized by IDFC Institute. My name is Niranjan Rajadhyaksha. I'm the Research Director and a Senior Fellow at the Institute. IDFC Institute is an independent think/do tank. And the reason we call ourselves a think/do tank is that we believe our task is not just research, but also help in implementation of policy. We work with various arms of the union government, with state governments and multilateral agencies to pursue our research and policy agenda. The broad theme of IDFC Institute's work is transitions, the very transitions going on in India over the years. For example, our move from being a poor country to being a middle-income country, from being a state-led economy to being a market-led economy, from a rural country to an urban country, and from an informal economy to a formal economy. These are just examples of the various transitions we sort of see as defining features of India in the 21st century. More specifically, we do work, we have very robust research and implementation programs in areas such as state capacity, the criminal justice system, urbanization, and most recently, data governance, which is exactly why we are having this webinar today. Before we start, I just wanted to make announce some housekeeping notes. You can see it on the slide on your computers. That this is a 60-minute section, and we'll begin with a discussion with the panelists. There'll be a round of Q&A, but attendees are requested to use the Q&A box to ask questions, and the moderator will then ask them to the panelists. This session is being recorded and live streamed on YouTube. So these are the broad housekeeping notes. Just one final thing. It's my pleasure to introduce our moderator of the day, Varad Pande. Varad is a partner at Omidyar Network India, where he leads the strategy, impact, and new initiatives practice. Varad has, of course, worked in various places, but he was in government for many years, working as an officer on special duty in the Ministry of Rural Development. I think Varad may remember that this is where we first met around 10 years ago. And in that role, Varad was also part of the rollout of Aadhaar, because the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme was one of the first big schemes where Aadhaar was tested. And of course, Varad has then followed this interest in data governance and social programs in subsequent roles at Dalberg and Omidyar. So Varad, over to you, and it's all yours now.
Thank you, Niranjan. Thank you very much. And thank you, IDFC Institute, for hosting this event. Good evening and welcome to everyone to what I think will be a riveting discussion on Aadhaar and beyond. Niranjan's already introduced me, so I don't need to do that, except to say that I have very fond memories of some early days of Aadhaar, including being in Tembli village in Nandurbar on I think September 29, 2010, when the first Aadhaar was given. And I'm sure Mr. Sharma and Naman, who was also there, may talk about it at some point. So we have a fabulous set of panelists today. Let me just start with Mr. Sharma. Mr. Sharma was, as you all know, the founding Director General of UIDAI, which conceived and implemented Aadhaar. He's a retired IAS officer. Until recently, was the chairman of the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India. In a distinguished career spanning, I think, more than 40 years, Mr. Sharma has led several technology for governance projects at the central and state government levels. Perhaps even before the word e-governance became a thing in the vocabulary. He holds a master's degree from IIT Kanpur and University of California, Riverside. Some very interesting anecdotes there that he shares in his book about those experiences too. Then we have Petra. Dr. Petra Sonderegger is a senior fellow at Dalberg, and most importantly, a co-author of the State of Aadhaar Report 2019. Having led the largest survey on Aadhaar, I think, ever conducted in 10 years, almost 10 years after its launch. Petra is great to have Petra to share with us the people's perspective. Has Aadhaar lived up to its promise that it started out with? Then we have Sucharita. Sucharita Mukherjee is co-founder of and CEO of Kaleidofin, a wealth tech platform focused on Bharat. Before founding Kaleidofin, she was the group CEO of IFMR Holdings. I think as a practitioner whose organizations have related to and used Aadhaar ecosystem in driving financial inclusion amongst the excluded and marginalized sections. So Charita will talk about innovation that Aadhaar has enabled unlock, especially in serving underserved segments of our country. And then we have Naman. Naman Pugalia is a serial entrepreneur, if I may say so, Naman. Currently CEO of Peppo, a fair ordering utility for e-commerce. Apart from various other roles, Naman was, I think, one of the founding volunteers of the Aadhaar experiment. He will share his perspectives as an outsider who got a chance to be an insider in this truly unique government project. So thank you, everyone. Mr. Sharma, let's start with you. Firstly, congratulations on the book. I know it was, I'm sure it was a labor of love. Delighted you took the time to write it. The story of Aadhaar is so intriguing at so many levels. And while so many were involved in its making, in some sense, you and Nandan were the co-pilots in the cockpit that made the plane fly. Nandan was sort of the more visionary outsider who sort of came in, and you were, I think he uses the word maverick for you at some place. So you were the maverick insider. And it probably needed such an unusual flying formation to get this giant off in the air. And I think as Nandan says in his preface to your book, a constellation of forces had to align to create this momentous story. So let me start with the start of that momentous story, Mr. Sharma. About how you started on that journey. There was an interesting set of anecdotes in your book about your first meeting with Nandan and how you signed up for this project. And maybe you can talk about it a little bit. What was going through your mind as you thought about this most unusual project, and what made you sign up for it? You're on mute, Mr. Sharma.
Well, thank you, Varad, for that wonderful introduction, and thanks to IDFC Institute for organizing this webinar. All my fellow panelists, and many of whom are longtime friends. Aadhaar has been an interesting sort of milestone in my own career. As you say, I've had about 42.5 years long career. I joined the administrative service at the age of 22, and I retired at 65. So 43 uninterrupted years of sort of service. When I got a call from the government of India, cabinet secretariat in those times, just reliving those memories, saying that Mr. Sharma, you have been identified to lead a national project of national importance. That's what they said. And I said, what is that project? So they said, we don't know what the project is, but you are supposed to meet Mr. Nandan Nilekani. So then I figured out, and there's a common friend of ours, KP Krishnan, also an IAS officer of Karnataka cadre. So he informed me that, sir, have you got a call already from the cabinet secretariat? I said, yes, I have, but I don't know what this project is all about. And then he informed me that this is a project, unique identity project, which Nandan Nilekani is heading, and he's looking for a CEO. And he also informed me that a number of IAS officers of that seniority have already refused. I mean, they were not willing to, kind of become the CEO of this project, because all of us look for, established office and all that. And this is a project where you have to start from the scratch. So he said that you meet him. And I said, all right, I'll meet him. And I never met Nandan. Of course, we have heard about him. So I met him. And when we met, and basically I said, I don't know how I will be able to work with somebody who is from a completely different background, because we have all been working with ministers, and ministers we know, generally from the beginning itself, we know the ministers and their supporters, and their, we've all been working in districts, and I've been working in Bihar and Jharkhand. So we are pretty familiar with those kinds of outfits, and we know who is the boss, and to what extent can we oppose him, to what extent we can sort of support him and stuff like that. But a technocrat, especially from a private sector, I'd never worked with. So I was a little apprehensive. And secondly, having worked in Bihar and being from a rural background, I am also a person who is not very sophisticated. I'm not very good at small talk, So I said, these are very, very sophisticated people. I don't know how I'll be able to work with these guys. But when I met him, and when then he described what this is all about and how this is, and he said, I'm looking for a person, and I looked at your CV, and I found that you had gone to California to do your master's at the age of 45. Your CV looks very, very interesting to me. So I thought you must be terribly interested in this information technology stuff. And I said, yes, I am. And then he said, yeah. So will you join this project? And I said, yes, I will. And then he asked me, why would you do that? I said, look, you are the, in the Infosys, you are the founding member of Infosys. You have a huge empire. You are a billionaire. And, for me, it's another job. So if you are leaving that job, leaving those things and are coming to join this project, which is completely startup, for me, it's another posting, it's another posting in Government of India. In any case, my state is refusing to let me go from Jharkhand, and they say I'm very indispensable. At the same time, they'll keep me getting transferred every, 8 months. So I said it is better to come over to Government of India and join something where I'll be at least having some stability in tenure. So I'm very happy to join, and of course, secondly, the most importantly, this sector interests me. Information technology, especially for governance, interested me, and therefore I said I'll join the project. So then, of course, I informed KP Krishnan, and then another stuff started, because then the government of Jharkhand said no, we cannot relieve him, because so the cabinet secretary told Mr. Nandan Nilekani, do you have a plan B? And Nandan said, no, I don't have any plan B. I just have this plan, and you have to sort of get him relieved. So then, of course, my mentor and the person who trained me, he was in the PMO as secretary, Mr. Mukesh Nandan Prasad, and he actually ensured that I get relieved. So it was a governor's rule, and he told the governor that if you don't relieve Mr. Sharma by close of business today, then you will have the consequences. So immediately I was informed that yes, you are now going to Government of India. So that's how it happened.
Great. The power of informal versus the formal, I think, in your role is quite interesting. And you also mentioned this whole thing in your book, I think, on when you did agree to Mr. Nilekani's request, and he told you we have a deal, and at that point, I think you got a little concerned.
No, he said, do we have a deal? So, this deal thing is a very interesting stuff. When you say the deal, in our times, deal is something very, very unholy nexus between two characters. So I said, what? He says, do we have a deal? And then I also went in the flow saying that, yes, we have a deal. And I understood what he meant by that.
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating. Let me ask you a quick follow on. This was, I think, the chemistry between you and Nandan obviously was important. But also, I'm sure there were early tensions, right? And I think one that you mentioned in your book again is this whole debate on should we be issuing a number or issuing a card. If I understood correctly, the Sarkar Walas wanted a card and the Bangalore Walas wanted a number, and you somehow resolved this issue. How did you resolve? This is just an example, of course, but how did you resolve this and other such issues, given the entirely different worlds your team came from?
See, the point is that we as Sarkari fellows, we had that notion that, whatever we think is right, especially from the time when we were implementing many, things at the state level. So somehow we think that we are much more grounded than other guys who just think technology. So it's after all not technology alone, but it's technology with, being implemented at the ground. So what happened was that in those times, actually connectivity was pretty bad. I mean, if you remember, only 10% guys had the internet, connections probably in those 2009, about 11 years back. Today, you have 700 million internet connections in our country. So one was the question of, we are living in a disconnected world. And if you have merely a connected artifact, then the problem is that many people will not be able to take advantage of that. So one was this idea that you have a card. But another idea was that because people live in jhopadis, people live in, under the bridge, they don't have any protection of any type. So if you just give them a number and written on some kind of paper, then that paper might get destroyed, and then you will not be able to recover the number, so there will be another hassle for them. So the idea was that you should write this on some durable stuff, some durable card. It was not a smart card we were thinking of. Initially I thought it was a smart card because of the connected world, but even if you think that is not required, but then at least it should be written on some durable stuff. So basically I was referring to that, and I said let's have some plastic stuff or something. But then we said that because the loss of card is not going to mean anything, because you can always print another one, and there's nothing called original in Aadhaar. I mean, there's no security feature, it's just a number. And when you have a connected world, then the tokens lose all value. For example, you now don't have any airline ticket. Initially they used to come in a jacket, and the lady used to have tear that perforated part to say that you have traveled. Today you don't even print your ticket, you just have it on your mobile. So in a connected world you don't really need tokens. So then I resolved the controversy, or I resolved the situation by saying that, look, card is essentially the soul. The number is the soul, that is indestructible, immortal and stuff like that. And card is merely something which holds that soul, which is the body. So the body may get changed, destroyed, and rejuvenated, reprinted. So let's have this. Let's not bother about the body's form, and let us call this that this soul will remain always connected. Whenever you can connect to the soul, your body may be weak, but that doesn't make a difference. So that's how we kind of resolved that controversy. But I think it was, I must credit this to Nandan's vision, that rather than getting bogged down into the situation that we are not connected, and therefore a connected artifact is not really the one which is good, whose time has come. He said connectivity will come. Let's forget about connectivity. Maybe it will be there currently at some various small places, but then overall everybody will have a connected stuff in his hand. And today the fact is that we have 700 million mobile, 1.2 billion mobile connections, and everybody having data connection, and the smartphones are increasing at the rate of 25 million a quarter. And so it's actually, we are more or less going to have a universal smartphone coverage. And once you have that, then everybody has the connectivity in his hand. And now you have a beautiful concept of JAM, which is Janadhan, Aadhaar and mobile, which means that mobile becomes a connectivity piece, Aadhaar becomes the digital identity, and the Janadhan account, which is the financial account, becomes the way to transfer money or to receive money, and therefore it's a very powerful construct.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great example of how you found middle ground on some of these things, and the framing makes a difference. The other thing I remember from that time is the fact that every resident, the card would come by post. I think first time in India, independent India or something, that every resident of this country got a letter from the state, and that itself, I think, signified a lot in the the empowerment message that Aadhaar brought to residents, which is great. Wanted to bring in some of the other panelists now. So I think, see, other than the empowerment and the first ever ID for a lot of people and all of that stuff that Aadhaar enabled, the fundamental case made for Aadhaar was really about, one was it will drive inclusion, and the second was it will drive innovation. If I was to put it in a very simple kind of way, the very conceptualization of Aadhaar as a foundational ID, which I think at that time at least was a big paradigm shift, enabled that it could be used for a plethora of different use cases, which started happening later. And this was pretty unique at the time, I think. So let me bring in Petra here. Petra, I think, as the author of the State of Aadhaar Report 2019, probably the world's largest survey on a digital ID program anywhere in the world, where I think your survey spoke to more than 2.5 lakh Indians in some way, a really gigantic and impressive effort. Let me ask you the simplest but billion-dollar question, which is, what does the data show? Has Aadhaar lived up to its promise of inclusion? What has worked and what has not worked from a people's perspective? Petra, you're on mute, I think.
Pardon me, that was my mute. Thanks, Varad. Yes, this was, given the size of India, being inclusive on anything is, of course, a massive challenge. And inclusion has multiple layers, but let's start with who has Aadhaar. And as of last year in our survey, we found that 90% of people have it. And this includes children and adults. And it's probably the first ID that has reached that many people. And it's truly for everyone. That said, we estimated that still about 100 million people did not have it at that time. That will have been reduced somewhat by now. And when we talk about inclusion, we of course want to see the most vulnerable groups in particular. And we found that they indeed had more difficulties getting Aadhaar than others. On the flip side, Aadhaar was the first ID that for about 8% of adults. So we found that they didn't have any of the functional IDs that other people had before, like ration cards, driver's license, voter ID. And it also served to further their inclusion in the sense that many of them then went on to get ration for the first time, to get a bank account or a SIM card for the first time, that they were more included, not just in having ID, but in having getting access to services. Unfortunately, the Aadhaar system and problems with Aadhaar also led to exclusion. And our estimate was that about 21 million people had been excluded from welfare because of problems with Aadhaar. Either they didn't have it, they couldn't update it with correct details, there was some issue that meant that they were deemed ineligible for welfare because of problems with Aadhaar. And this also extended to private sector services. So for example, 3% of people could not open a bank account because of an issue with their Aadhaar. And this was, of course, at a time when Aadhaar was still or had just been rendered not mandatory for banks. People also faced problems in accessing services where they were eligible. So for example, PDS authentication failed for about 5% of people, and a third of them did not get their ration that month. So we can see that it had inclusive aspects. It had also exclusionary aspects. And the fact that problems with Aadhaar led to this exclusion was exacerbated by the fact that it proved to be really difficult to fix things. So updating was the hardest part of any process with Aadhaar. If I remember correctly, 1 in 5 updates had actually failed. So people were kind of stuck if their Aadhaar didn't work. So overall, I think Aadhaar really benefited a lot of people. It really lived up to the aspiration of providing an ID for all of India. But the job isn't finished yet. As with many such things, those who were disadvantaged to begin with are also facing struggles here. And where the difficulties happen, things need to be smoother. So people who can't get it need to get it now. Where the system fails or there are system integration issues, those need to be fixed. And there just needs to be a really true focus on vulnerable populations, since the aspiration is inclusion, and since Aadhaar is mandatory for many of the, critical life-saving services that people need to access from the government.
Yeah, thanks, Petra. And I think it's interesting because there's been so much debate about Aadhaar. I think the picture that your work paints is, if you take the mantra of, greatest good for greatest number type of approach, then you can say Aadhaar has delivered. However, if you really believe in, is it helping the last person in the row? then you still have work to do, sort of message, right?
And I think it's not just the last person, it's the most vulnerable person,
Yes,
right?
yes.
It's the homeless family. It's someone who lives in a very deep rural village who can't get access or doesn't have connectivity and that sort of thing. I think that's important to remember.
So were there one or two most important things that came out of your work in terms of what the state should do now to sort of meet that?
Yeah, I think renewing the drive to get it to those people who don't have it and do want it is a really important one. Then making updates easier and just fixing any process and access problems involved there. And then I would say exception handling mechanisms for when things go wrong. Say in biometric authentication at a PDS store doesn't work. What is the exception handling mechanism? Say somebody wants to enroll in Minrega and has a problem with their Aadhaar card. What is the exception handling mechanism? I think those were the big ones.
Yeah. Thanks, Petra. So Sucharita, let me bring you in here. I think you work at a very interesting intersection of, I think, inclusion and innovation. And I think you actually represent an entire community of innovators who have in some way bought into the promise of Aadhaar and the ecosystem around it to create, innovative business models that can serve previously, underserved communities. In your case, digital financial services and products. How do you see it from your vantage point? Has Aadhaar helped innovators like you and the people you serve?
No, I think that's, the answer to that is an emphatic yes, because the greater good always, works for businesses. In a way, if we sort of go back a decade, just a decade, we were looking at customer authentication via voter ID cards, ration cards, letters from the panchayat, letters from a gazetted officer. There were all kinds of identity documents which would take a lot of time and money to verify, because the authenticity of each of these was suspect. And businesses like, let's say, microfinance institutions, which provide loans to informal sector customers, would spend at least a few hundred rupees just on authentication. This doesn't even include sort of travel cost, cost of reaching the customer, and so on. So in a way, that it has made financial services much more accessible simply by taking out that first big barrier. What is the reason why only lending models were present for the informal sector customer? It's also because margins are high in lending, and when you have costs of authentication running into a few hundred rupees, you of course need to have a business model that can actually absorb that cost. So when we look at, let's say, our business model, which is savings focused, insurance focused, these business models would not have been possible without a cost of identifying an individual which is near zero. So in a way, would businesses be interested in offering savings and insurance and a more complete suite of financial services without Aadhaar? I don't think so, because it simply would not be viable to do so. So, I think that it makes all sorts of new innovations possible. We're able to assess financial health properly. We are, then able to give the customer a financial solution that's actually much, much more stable from the perspective of the customer's long-term financial health. However, I think there is still a lot of work to be done. So, for example, in the wake of the pandemic, benefits were distributed to a lot of our customers. And when we did a survey of how, let's say, the Aadhaar-enabled payment system was working, which was the way in which most people were taking out the money from bank accounts, because banks had really long queues, and therefore, most of the cash out transactions were happening at BC points. And if the AEPS system failed, it basically meant that you didn't have access to the money which you really badly required, because there was no employment. And I don't think, I think that in April and May in particular, there was a huge load on APS, which led to failures shooting through the roof, and that was certainly avoidable. It became better, and in some sense, that I think we do need to look at making sure that these systems actually work, especially in a time of emergency. I think that's important. I think the other bit that's important is all the other pieces of infrastructure that go along with Aadhaar. So, for example, everybody has a bank account. Yes, when we go to our customers, it is true that everybody does have a bank account. But we do see that how many people have Aadhaar linked to their mobile number, how many people have a bank account with a debit card, how many people have a bank account with a debit card and a PIN. How many people have a functioning bank account, and how many people have a bank account which doesn't have usurious charges. Now then the system starts to creak. So what I'm saying is that I think Aadhaar is one part of the infrastructure, and we need some of the other parts, and I completely agree with Petra that we need a push to drive and make some of that infrastructure smoother. So I would say that, some of those initiatives would make it even more powerful.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. I think two things you said there which really stuck with me. One was, the financial inclusion piece of Aadhaar is often seen through the lens of payments and DBT, right? That's sort of the most obvious one. But the fact that customer acquisition, for example, in cases beyond lending, like your organization, becoming easier and less costly was an important thing beyond just the payment piece of this. I think the second, which is I think the point that, look, Aadhaar is not a silver bullet for all problems of service delivery, right? Like, it's part of a larger ecosystem which has both other tech infrastructure and non-tech infrastructure. And unless we fix those other pieces, we can't expect Aadhaar will solve every problem. So I think that point is well taken. Naman, let me bring you in here as someone who has seen the Aadhaar journey from very early days. Let me just first ask you this, right? 2010, you're a young person who has got fancy degrees and many options ahead of you. What made you sort of go take up this challenge, and what made you board this aircraft?
Thanks, Varad. So I think, the short answer to what made me and people like me board this aircraft was, the very prospect of fixing its wings midair. I think, that's a compelling proposition for anybody who's looking at what's going on. But a more elaborate response to that would be that I graduated in May 2009, which was just a few months after Lehman had collapsed. So the employment prospects, were fairly grim for our class, but there were silver linings, right, which translated into a greater risk appetite, the ability to make unconventional choices and be adventurous with a career trajectory, which a crisis of that sort of the one that we're currently undergoing often present. Around that time, I'd noticed reports about a unique ID mission coming together in government. And, these were very early days. So Nandan had just started outlining what was going to happen. There were talks of him perhaps joining the government to make this happen. And, the very audacity of that thought at that point was striking. For a liberal arts graduate, it was truly a dream mission, provided someone was, of course, willing to take a chance on people like us. So I actually wrote a cold email to Nandan back then, who said, why don't you check in with me at the end of the year? So with 6 months to go, I decided to backpack across the country. And while I was doing that, I documented the successes and failures of one of the largest schemes at that point, one that you worked on, Varad, Narega. Now, my travels also took me to Bangalore at some point, closer to the end of the year, where I had a chance meeting with some of the folks who were already working on UID, and they had a deep interest in what I was uncovering as part of my travels. And by the end of our meeting, they asked me if I would be interested in a full-time position at the authority. This whole arc, I guess, which started with a cold email and ended with this fortuitous meeting in Bangalore, led to my first full-time job, which was a role with the UIDAI. And what drew us to the authority at that point, I think it really comes down to perhaps three things. First, I think it really was a very unique crucible for entrepreneurs, both from the private sector and the public sector. Earlier you used the word maverick, and so has Nandan, to describe Ram Sewak ji. And I think, him and others like him in government across services have this entrepreneurial streak. And many of us, of course, in the private sector tend to have it. So it got us all together. The second thing that struck me was, the sheer audacity of the mission. I think a headcount of 1 billion residents of a complex nation like ours was always going to be fun, irrespective of whether it succeeded or not. And finally, it posed a deeply provocative design challenge. And I mean that, not simply in terms of the technological design, but otherwise as well. So I would say, these were all the factors that drew me and many people like me to the Unique ID Authority.
Yeah. No, so it's taking a step up from, your example. And as you said, it was a sort of it became a magnet for a lot of people. And really, this is, you could argue Aadhaar was a public-private partnership in so many ways. But one unique way it was a public-private partnership was this unique hybrid HR model, right? Where it blended folks like Mr. Sharma, folks like you and others from the private sector under one org. And I'm sure this wasn't easy because it was, again, a first of its kind. And I think, Mr. Sharma, you talk about it in the book also. And I'll come to you on that. But first, Naman, just continuing with you, how was the atmosphere given this very unique, I would say, dynamic? Did young people like you feel inspired? Did you feel confused? How did it work?
Yeah, it was absolutely electric, Varad. I think everybody who played a founding role in the organization ensured that they really forged a culture which prized ability over experience, and that's refreshing in any organization, let alone a governmental startup. So that led to an uncomfortable excitement about the mission throughout its tenure. And there were several, highs and lows that we kind of collectively dealt with. There were frequent successes, right from the first enrollment client, which incidentally Ram Sewak ji himself coded. Taking that to the field for a proof of concept study, and that client just working, out there, to the first data packet kind of coming back and hitting our servers. Every single time Aadhaar was mentioned in the union budget, for the accomplishments it was already kind of making, and and the budgets that were allocated for its expansion. So several of these things really stood out, and I think as part of the launch, for instance, Varad, you and I worked together and discovered just how effective government can be when it wants to be. When there's a clear, inspiring brief, it tends to get the various arms of government to work in tandem. In that sense, I think what we collectively discovered was that policy as an art form is fairly close to, to use a musical metaphor, which I know you'll appreciate, to Kavali. There's a call and response going on, and as long as it's inspiring and clear, everyone's going to respond with gusto. It was great fun to kind of chance upon this throughout the journey. Of course, there were setbacks as well, and I think that kind of got us all closer together. One anecdote which I'd like to share, at this point is that and I think there's sufficient distance from the mission now to safely narrate this. There were lots of idiosyncrasies when it came to folks from the public sector, and equally, these strange traits were present among those from the private sector as well. And we would talk about it, in whispers. I think at some point it was important to appreciate these differences. So what we would often do as part of our get-togethers is organize these skits where we take a work situation and folks from the private sector would play those from the public sector and vice versa. And in doing so, it gave us not just an effective icebreaker, but really catalyzed our working relationship, because we could bring to the fore all the things that we really appreciated about each other and all the things that we thought were irritants about each other. And like this, I mean, I just shared one anecdote, but there were instances of this sort where every opportunity that presented itself for us to kind of, be a closely knit organization and a functional unit, we take that with all the vigor that there was to ensure that we collectively succeeded.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think there's a separate book which needs to be written on the organizational culture, human resources, etc., of learnings from something like this. But Mr. Sharma, let me bring you back here, which is, I know in the book you also talk about how this was both exciting but also challenging, with almost like sometimes camps being formed within the organization. But it looks like ultimately you sort of figured it out. So firstly, any reflections on what made it work? But also more importantly, as a seasoned civil servant, why are we not able to do more of these hybrid HR models in government, when it's now very, very clear, I think, that the biggest and the hardest problems of the country need people of different skills, expertise, domain knowledge to come together to solve. Despite the experiment of Aadhaar, why have we not been able to innovate more on this after that?
Well, thanks, Varad. Let me first, before I respond to your questions, let me first deal with Petra and Sucharita's issues. And I want to agree with them that Aadhaar should not lead to exclusion. And that is not inclusion is actually a very, very fundamental philosophy with which we started, and we went to the extent of, enrolling people who were excluded, like people in the orphanages and other places. So inclusion is extremely, extremely important from our philosophical point of view. However, what has happened is that when you started enrolling people and you started covering the whole nation, suppose you covered 90% and 10% is left out, then obviously for any enrollment agency, it did not, provide them a business case that if there are 5 people and they have a capacity of 50, they will not like to keep that camp there. So therefore, it is now important for the government to ensure that you have, these common service centers in each panchayat. They should be converted into Aadhaar enrollment camps so that a person can go very, very easily to each panchayat. And that is basically the enrollment model. And they are in any case delivering some IT services. So I completely agree that for updates and for new enrollments who are left out, we should provide a very, very easy system, because otherwise, people will just get excluded. Second thing is that people sometimes start, using technology in a very blind manner. So for example, if you say that PDS ration will be delivered only after authentication, then people say if your authentication is failed, you will not get the ration. Now, technology may fail, technology doesn't work especially in our kind of diverse country where there is no tower sometimes, there is no connectivity sometimes, the bijli may go out and other kinds of things may happen. So therefore, blindly depending on technology, after all, we are not robots. We are not some vending machines who are delivering ration from a vending machine. There's a human being sitting there, and there is another human being who is basically come to sort of take ration. And it is not only the machine which will intermediate. Sometimes when the machine fails, the intermediation can happen, the exception management can happen. And you will not believe, in our first book, which was published in August of 2009, we had said that Aadhaar will solve the identity problem and authentication problem. However, at the same time, it is the agencies who are delivering services, they have to put in exception handling mechanism in place. And that, unfortunately, sometimes people blame Aadhaar that it is because of Aadhaar that the exclusion is taking place. Actually, what is happening is people are using Aadhaar authentication in a very, very robo kind of manner. And sometimes people use it only to discredit this system, because they want to go back to the old system where the fair price shop dealer will have the advantage of, denying somebody that your ration is not there and other kinds of things. Now he can't, because now there's no proxy. A cannot take B's ration because he has to authenticate, A has to authenticate there. So I think because of the transparency and because of this system having become cleaner, people have more motives to actually discredit the system. And many of the fellows at the lower rung, they believe, for example, Rajasthan, people seeded wrong Aadhaar number in the ration cards, with the result that Mr. A was going and he has B's Aadhaar number and he will not be able to authenticate against his Aadhaar. So there are people who are playing games to ensure that the system does not succeed. Aadhaar essentially solves only one problem. And I completely agree with Sucharita that Aadhaar is only one piece. Aadhaar solved the most common problem of all domains, which require identity authentication and identity provision. So essentially, it is not solving, domains problem is not being solved. It's only identity problem. And that is actually a common problem of all domains. So solving that problem brings in a huge amount of efficiency, because then, you are absolved from the responsibility of proving that Mr. X is X. So if I'm going to open a bank account, that X is X part is done. Now the other parts, eligibility part of bank account will happen. Similarly, if I'm going to get a mobile SIM, X is X part is done and other things will happen. So essentially, when it solves a most common problem, that is why it is pluggable to all systems. But all systems must take care of exception management. It is not really the Aadhaar's job. Of course, I agree that Aadhaar's job is now to ensure complete inclusion. Nobody should be excluded from this system. And we should have some good update mechanism in place, which is actually not, again, bureaucratic. Because ultimately, let us realize we enroll people on the basis of the sarpanch's certificate or somebody's certificate. Introducer system where I will say I know Varad and I will give my Aadhaar number and Varad will get enrolled without any papers. That is the whole issue. So that's one part. Secondly, coming back to the private sector and public sector and why that experiment is not being replicated. Actually, what happens, Varad, and I have also seen many of these projects in this career. What happens is that there are two models. One is a consultant-led model, whereby there is a consultant who comes in and actually gives a gyan about how the project should be structured, designed, and done. So that's one model. And where the joint secretary or the secretary or other fellows in the department will say, "Theek hai bhai, this consultant is going to do the job and he will do a good job for me." And obviously, consultant has his own way of thinking, his own understanding of the situation, and many times the consultant learns from the joint secretaries and then gives gyan to them again. So it's like a circular kind of process. So this is one problem. This is one model where projects are being done, especially the IT projects. And IT projects, because bureaucrats think that we don't really know much about them, and therefore the consultant will do the stuff. The other model is basically where a better model, little better, which is basically you hire a PMU, the project management unit or project monitoring unit. That PMU largely consists of private sector people. But then what happens is that PMUs are, sort of working with the joint secretaries and bureaucrats. They never become a part of the whole organization. So they also keep on doing their own things, and people start using the bureaucrats without much understanding. Many of them who may not have understanding, they actually start telling what to do. So the PMU fellows, like the coolies, they just do whatever the boss wants them to do. So this is another model. The best model which works is actually the model which we employed in UID Authority of India. Essentially, there we said both of us are partners. The private sector people are also as much a part of the organization as we are, and we will share our understanding with each other. They have certain strengths, the private sector people, technology strength, etc. We also have the strength of working in the public space, and we know how things work in the field, etc. So let us combine both these things. Also, let us combine the agility of the private sector and actually the accountability and other kinds of process robustness of the public sector. Scale, for example, scale is really something which public sector does and private sector does not. So these are some of the things which we combine, and that combination will happen only when you develop and create an organic structure which actually leverages the best of both private and public sector. And that's why Aadhaar succeeded. I also think that Aadhaar succeeded because all of us, the guys who came to Aadhaar, by the way, the officers, typical, system in the government is that you create an organization and you post somebody as a CEO, post somebody as a deputy CEO, and stuff starts happening. That fellow comes and he's not willing to, work on that organization, but he's posted nevertheless, because that's how it works. In UID Authority of India, what we did was we actually informally invited government people, do you want to join? And there were many people in the government at various parts. They wanted to join. So they were actually, in some sense, volunteered for joining an Aadhaar. So they already had some kind of passion. That's one part. And secondly, some people who were just posted like that, they actually went out also quite quickly. I know a couple of examples, but I'll not give their names. But those guys said, oh, I would have worked very much in home ministry. Because when I tell my people in the village, what are you working for? And I say, I'm working for some identity. So they are very unimpressed, If I say that I'm working in the home ministry and, dealing with police and CRPF, they would have been very, very, happy. So I'm not very happy in this organization. So there are people like that. But I think it is important that we create this kind of synergy and the kind of enthusiasm. I tell you that the enthusiasm I have never seen in my whole life. Everybody was passionate about it. Naman, of course, has worked, and they went to Rajasthan and somebody told Naman that yehi to hamare jeevan ka Aadhaar hai. And Naman came back saying that, oh, sir, Aadhaar is a good name. And then, this is how it happened. So everybody, even when we failed, we were actually reflecting together. So that kind of situation has to happen. And in large technology project, Nandan had chaired a meeting in which he gave a report about TagUp, large technology startups or projects, how they should happen. And he has given a model. And I think that model, if you adopt, I'm sure many of these projects could have been done much better. And this is I think the formula for success.
Yeah, I think that third model that you described, I feel like, if we could have 10 of those in the country, we could do a lot with it. But one curious question before I move on, did you have the Phite Wali file in UIDAI or not? Because the red tape file, the Phite Wali file.
Yeah, we have the red tape file. Basically, what happened was that, when we joined, and I think I have not written about this in the book, but I can share with you. When we joined, then Nandan asked me, boss, this is the way he talks. He said, boss, why do you write such long notes in the file? What is the problem? Why can't we take a decision and we say this is the decided and finished? Have a minutes of the meeting, MOM, and decide it. I said, boss, the problem is that this is not my father's money. And this is not your money. I could not have said your father's money. It probably sounded a bit bad. So I said, it's not your money. Of course, you have a lot of money, but this is a public money. This is people's money. This is a taxpayer's money. And therefore, we have to spend it like we are spending our own money. And we have to justify why are we spending it this way. And we don't have to justify to ourselves. We have to justify for posterity. Because there are 3 C's, CAG, CVC, and CBI. So these 3 C also may at any point of time, I might be retired and be somewhere in my village, and some daroga of CBI will go say that Mr. Sharma, come over, you are required in Aadhaar, that scam which you did. So I said, look, for that also, we have to fully justify on paper. Because one of my gurus in earlier times in Bihar used to say, Sharma ji, paper does not die, paper never dies. So I said we have to write it down, and that is why this is what is required. So he says, acha, this is good. But as I said, think of it as a file ka pet bharna, just file ko complete karna, pet bharna. So then what happened was initially he was very like everybody else in private sector is. We are private sector fellows, don't have great respect for the Sarkari fellows. They think that they are sloppy, they are very slow, they don't work, they are rule oriented, stuff like that, which is largely true also. So he was having those ideas saying that all these Sarkari characters are useless, generally fellows. So then what happened when we started giving these files and decisions to him, then he got a little scared. He said, boss, itni jaldi tum file la rahe ho yaar, this will create problems. तो मैंने koi problem nahi hoga. बोले file का पेट भर गया. हमने कहा बिल्कुल भर गया. So then he became a little, sort of this decisions are being taken too fast. And that's why, so ultimately it's again a question of, establishing a mutual trust and establishing that kind of relationship, which is very, very important. The private sector fellows thought Nandan was their boss. The public sector fellows immediately thought that R.S. Sharma is our boss. And if we would have behaved like the respective bosses of our domains and this thing, the project would have never been done. Right. So it's important that you work together in a way that, nobody treats you like that you are representing another group. Yeah. And therefore that distrust should not happen.
Yeah. And nice to hear you bureaucratized Nandan a little bit, and you probably also got privatized a little bit. Yeah. In that sense, yeah. So we have a lot of questions. We're also going to run out of time. If I have the permission of the group, if you could stay on for 5 or 10 minutes more, because there are lots of questions and there are lots of interest. So I can't not ask this question because my organization does a lot of work on responsible tech and data privacy and all of these things. And Mr. Sharma, a lot of your book you've devoted, I think, one whole chapter to the whole privacy question. You also devoted another chapter to what I think you called Coalition Against Aadhaar, right? Which is really about civil society, etc. And one of the puzzles in my mind is that, despite thinking about civil society, community engagement from the very outset, despite you and Nandan putting in hours and hours of time for personal outreach, this was probably a huge PR issue for you. Probably one of your toughest battles. If the case for Aadhaar was so rock solid, why do you think on this front you struggled so much, and could you have done better?
I think, Varad, that's an excellent question, but unfortunately, I do not have an answer to this question. In fact, that has bothered me since last 10 years or so, since 11, 12 years, that what did we do wrong? Why did we not, succeed, or why were we not able to convince the civil society? Of course, there were a large number of people in civil society organizations who are convinced about the goodness of intentions, goodness of things which we did. But there are other large sections who are not really convinced, and I don't know how. I mean, we started from the very beginning. We created a vertical which is called Civil Society Outreach, and one of the outstanding person, Raju Rajgopal, became was put in charge of that. He had done a lot of work in the USA, in Malaysia, and other places, and India also, in Chennai, around Chennai. So I think we did everything, and we organized the initial discussions, and everything was going well. But somehow I think we also, I mean, should I use the word floundered, or we also could not convince, and somehow it became a situation where we started seeming like villains. So I remember one anecdote. First of all, there was a meeting in Planning Commission, now Niti Aayog, and there was a huge discussion with the civil society, and one of the guys asked that, how did you start this project without taking our approvals, civil society into confidence? And typical bureaucrat that I am, I told them that we don't have any process in the government to take the approval of the civil society. We take the approval of our minister, we take the approval of the finance department, but there's no clause or there's no rule which says that you should take the approval of the civil society before starting a project. So, and ultimately it's a government project, and we are just implementing a project. It's not as if we are the one who is conceptualizing it. Secondly, there was another seminar in NLS Bangalore, again the civil society seminar, and 2 or 3 persons really sort of told us that what sin we are committing by having this project. And I told them that I was really very, very happy that I am doing something for the country and something very good, but now I have a very serious guilt feeling that after hearing you, as what a big sin we are committing against the people of India to have started this project. So somehow I really have no answer, Varad, as to why we could not, take them into confidence.
I was wondering if fellow panelists had any thoughts on this. From a Sucharita, you meet a lot of. Civil society is a representation of community, right? Did you think Aadhaar did a good enough job of connecting with community? Or is doing what are things projects like Aadhaar could do better? I suppose in the community connect piece.
Yeah, I think that the success stories of Aadhaar in making inclusion a reality, the grassroots level stories, from social entrepreneurs, I think they could have come out more, and I think a lot of people would have spoken out in favor as well. I just think that there was an inadequate balance. I think the civil society was dominated by one faction alone. And the other part of civil society, and I consider myself part of civil society as well, that voice, was not heard very well. So it basically became UIDAI versus one part of civil society. But I think the thing to do was to activate another part of civil society. And that voice, I think, was weak. But I think, even now, I do think it makes sense to actually amplify the success stories, because, you also, from our privileged positions, we can always say that, hey, you know what, this compromises my right to privacy in a way that damages me. But what about all the services that you would not get? Because every question, I think, has two sides to it and has to be weighed. So first of all, I think the right to privacy is an important one, but I think the exclusion that results from not having Aadhaar also needs to be adequately explored, talked about. And I don't think that thoughtful dialogue, has happened yet. And I think even so, it's better late than never. And I think it makes sense to really do that, now and for the future, because
Sucharita, we might have lost you a little bit. Petra, let me ask you also this question, because I know as part of the State of Aadhaar survey, one of the things that I feel didn't get as much attention in the public domain was that you also did a lot of qualitative work, I think, of just going and having much more in-depth conversations with people and communities, etc. Did you get a sense of what sort of the texture of the community perception or connect with Aadhaar? You're on mute.
Sorry, I'm on mute again. One of the most striking findings, even from the survey for us, was the really vast majority that was satisfied with Aadhaar. And from our conversations, the in-depth interviews we had, I think we found that communities felt this was an effort by the government for the people. This was something to help them and to protect them, to recognize them, and that those two things in and of themselves were very important. And when we highlight the exclusion that people were facing, of course, nobody should experience exclusion because of Aadhaar, but we also found that a lot of people were experiencing exclusion or denial of service, delay of service, for many, many, many other reasons. So this was not, it was maybe not perceived in the same way as we perceive it. It was perceived as maybe one more hurdle among many, and many other hurdles were much higher. So perhaps Aadhaar was in some cases not performing as it was intended to, but maybe it was still performing better than other options that people had. But I also think when we speak of the engagement of civil society, I think what it really highlights here is something that that Mr. Sharma also just highlighted, which is that technology cannot solve anything. Sometimes we tend a little bit towards techno-utopianism in the sense that, we think the system, the processes or the legal system are broken and that technology can fix it. But the technology can only work insofar as it is, well implemented through processes, regulated by the laws that are necessary, and society as a whole defines those. So I think it's really a sort of a warning not to get carried away with the technology and to let it run too far ahead of legal systems that need to keep it in check and make it function.
Yeah, great. I think that's a great segue into, I think, maybe just one round with the audio with you all before we leave. And I was going to ask you if looking forward, we did a lot of looking back right now, but looking forward, I wanted to just ask each of you, what would be, if there was one big takeaway, from the Aadhaar experience, and you've seen it from different vantage points. What would be the one biggest learning or takeaway as we build the next set of transformative solutions for our citizens? Maybe you guys can. Maybe Naman, I'll start with you.
Sure, Varad. Yeah, I think, look, the single biggest takeaway for me, Varad, was the art of consensus and coalition building that we learned at the Unique ID Authority. This idea that people with diverse points of view can still sit across the table, forge a consensus, and go after it while delivering value to every stakeholder who's present in the room. I think the way in which the leadership of the UIDAI went about showcasing just how this ought to be done was truly inspiring. And I think missions in government, outside of government, working at scale ought to kind of learn that art from our experiences. So that really would be the biggest takeaway for me.
Great, thanks. Sucharita, you are back. Maybe you can go next.
Yes, I'm back. Sorry about my internet connection. So for me, I think like Mr. Sharma also said, I feel like there are many unfinished projects. Aadhaar solves identity, financial services, financial solutions. You need other systems to work well in unison. So, for example, as far as
Sucharita, we are losing
the financial system is concerned, one big question is...
Maybe you can go off the screen. I think we are losing your audio a little bit. If it's a bandwidth thing, yeah. Maybe you can try now, and you're on mute.
Okay. Am I audible now?
Yes, you are. Sucharita, can you hear us? We can't hear you.
Why don't...
Yeah, maybe we'll come back to you then. Let's go to Petra. Petra, over to you.
So
back to me. I'll try and move to it work.
Okay. Over to Petra in the meantime.
Okay. I think the big takeaway for me is that, the ambition and the scale of this project were truly mind-blowing and pretty much unheard of when it started. And that it's even possible to do something like this is quite amazing. And sometimes perhaps such projects are not ambitious enough, but that what in the end really makes them succeed beyond the technology itself are really the processes and the institutions, and the embeddedness in society as a whole.
Great, thank you. Mr. Sharma, maybe you can offer your last words.
Yeah, thank you, Varad. It has been a very, very fascinating discussion thus far, and I think there can't be one single very sort of one-liner formula for such projects to succeed. But I think a couple of things which will make certain things, these kinds of projects succeed. One is that you have to have a team. You know, we have a lot of ideas. A lot of people give a lot of ideas and give reports, and then finally, when it comes to execution, execution is the key in such projects. And in execution, I think a couple of things which are required. One is we should be very clear as to what is the problem that we are trying to solve. Many times, you know, in technology projects, what happens, you begin with some problem and then you say, oh, this can also be solved, and let's bring that also, let's bring that also. So I think this is one confusion which happens. For example, we started saying that our job is to provide identity and a bare identity to the people of India, residents of India, which means that we are just saying X is X. We are not concerned about the eligibility. And that way, when you refer to a new paradigm, this is actually Aadhaar is world's first identity without eligibility. Typically, you have identities which are, let's say, driving license. Now, driving license is also de facto used as an identity paper, but actually it's an authorization to drive, that the person is capable of driving. Similarly, a voter ID card is also often carried as an identity paper, but it's actually a card, something which enables you to vote. So it's actually an eligibility document. The underlying person is an identity. That is what we tried to solve, and we remained on that. We'll provide one unique identity to people, and secondly, we'll provide single service of authenticating that identity online. And these two are the only things which remain, the sort of offerings of Aadhaar. Other things which are built, which are very similar, electronic KYC and other kinds of things, but other domains are using that. So one is a clear articulation of what problem you are trying to solve. That's one part which should be very clearly understood. Secondly, I think you should build teams which come from diverse backgrounds. If you are doing a large technology project, a technology project has a lot of social dimensions, lot of, it is ultimately to be implemented in the ground. And I'm a firm believer backgrounds and about their things. The real creativity comes at the intersection of different kind of vocations and professions and experiences. So the real thing comes when the real learning happens, when you have people from diverse background and with the willingness to understand each other. And that will happen only when you sort of invite people that, do you want to join something? So people will join typically what interests them, and then then that becomes a very important point. So I think if you have large projects, and there are many in the government, unfortunately, many times we flounder, we fail, and we just keep on, years passed, but nothing happens, no delivery takes place. It is important that you have these projects done in a mission mode and done with a very clear articulation of what we want to do and what we want to solve. And then you must have very clear, sort of laid down principles or targets or whatever. Then it can be done. Otherwise, somebody becomes a part-time CEO of some project, and then he goes away, and then somebody else comes, and there's no continuity of vision. Then things just happen. Things just sort of flounder, and unfortunately the targets and the whole focus also keeps on changing. Because somebody, for example, UIDAI today, I'm not saying that it has changed, but for example, the focus of UIDAI at this point of time should be to actually enroll the rest of the people and create those CSCs and common service. There are 350,000 common service centers in 600,000 villages of this country. They are within reach of 1 kilometer. Now, what happened? Some CSC operator did some issues relating to password or something, and then the entire CSCs were banned from providing Aadhaar services. This is not really the way things are done. So my view is that we should ensure that things keep on. We ultimately, what are we doing these projects for? We are doing it for the people of this country. And if people are not the central focus of this project, then I think it is not worth doing. So I would end there that we need to have diverse teams. We need to have clear articulation of purpose, and then we have to have very clear sort of guidelines or targets specified for that.
Yeah, very helpful. One of the things, Mr. Sharma, I've always wondered in government, to your point on sharp focus, is this title of somebody is joint secretary and mission director or joint secretary and CEO.
Yeah.
So you always wonder, he has 15 other things. If you see his work allocation, he has 15 things, then he's also CEO of a mission. I mean, a mission cannot work like that, right? If you do it that way, which is, I think, a great oddity in our system, which somehow persists. Sucharita, I know you're back. Maybe a final word from you.
Yes, very quickly, I wanted to say that this mission approach should be applied to other, big challenges of the country. For example, I want to speak about one. Does every, Indian have a universal bank account which is seeded with Aadhaar, which is actually capable of setting up a UPI ID? And this is a difficult mission, but it's one that must be completed in order to realize the full benefits of the first identity project. So I do think that one lesson to take away is that why stop here? Let's find worthwhile large problems to solve exactly in mission mode, and while completely agreeing to Petra's point on exception handling. We cannot handle this like robots. That I think that is the one lesson that we must take away also.
Yeah, I think it's a great inspiring note. Let's find a few more such missions that we need to do while not falling prey to what Petra called techno-utopianism, I think was the phrase. Great. Thank you, Mr. Sharma. Thank you for joining us. Fabulous. And, audience, once again, please read the book. There are, we only skimmed the surface. There are incredible, both, I think, anecdotes and lessons for the future in this book. So please do buy it. Mr. Sharma, we are still waiting for the Kindle edition. I know it's on Amazon, but a Kindle edition would be great as well. So maybe you can tell your publisher that too.
Actually, Kindle is also available on Amazon.
Okay, fabulous, great.
And I also wanted to add one thing. Mr. Pranam Mukherjee, I remember him today. He has written a blurb for my book after reading it, and he was not keeping good health. But he was the greatest inspiration to us during this project. Whenever I would meet him for some meetings, because he was chairing the EGOM meetings, the empowered group of ministers, he will immediately ask in his typical, Bengali accent, Mr. Sharma, what is the run rate? And the run rate means what is the rate of enrollment? And I'll say, sir, 1 million per day. Oh, 1 million per day? Very good, very good. Keep it up, Mr. Sharma. So he was actually one of the most inspiring persons whom I kind of came in contact with, and he would always be willing to sort of support us, and he did support us as finance minister. Actually, I think this project has had too many existential crises, and it was for him that we survived. So
great. Yeah. On that note, thank you again. Thank you, Mr. Sharma. Thank you, Naman. Thank you, Petra. Thank you, Sucharita, for bringing such great, diverse perspectives. Thank you, audience, for joining us. I hope it was an interesting discussion. Thank you, Niranjan, Prakhar, Ria, and IDFC Institute for hosting us. And until we meet again, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, Varad.
Thank you.
And wonderful.
Thank you, everybody.
Moderation of the session. Thanks.